Okay, so in this video, it's going to be an entire comic book page compressed down to about 50 minutes or so. So I've sped up all of my drawing time by a factor of 4, and I've also edited out a whole bunch of the kind of repetitive parts of the page. As with all comic books, most of it is drawing very similar items repeatedly for many, many pages, so there's no reason to show the same process repeated over and over again. I'll just focus in on the relevant details and then assume that you'll understand that the rest of the page is built in a similar way. So this is a fight scene, and the reason I'm pulling this page out is just because the mechanics of the storytelling are kind of unique. If I were doing a page of, let's say, people going on a hiking trip, the way that I would organize the page and the way that the panels flow would be very different from this, where it's lots of action, lots of people in these dynamic, unbalanced poses, and it's all action that's happening within a matter of seconds in real world time. So I'm creating a lot of things beyond just portraying the basic content of the story. I'm trying to lay out a mood and a panel flow that adds to the dynamism and the unbalanced, uncertain kind of action that's happening on this page. And this process that I'm doing right now is almost like a diagram. I barely even call this drawing because it's scarcely more than stick figures, and it's really more like a bridge between the written script and the actual artwork, just to see how the script starts to get born onto the visual page. And since I'm the author of the script, it's pretty minimal. I mean, this whole page is described in about one sentence, but how it's going to lay out is quite complex. And just so you know, this is a scene that's like a fight between a human and these other people who are kind of like centaurs or like a lion version of centaurs. So they, instead of 2 legs, they have these 4 lion legs, just in case you're wondering why there are those kind of strangely proportioned characters happening there. And the basic sequence is in the previous page, the human character has wound up to kick that other character in the face, and then there's another guy. This is happening in a prison, so there's this sort of magical prison guard who will conjure a knife out of thin air and then throw that knife, and those are the beats of the page. The human character, the bald woman in the top right panel, is kicking one of the prison guards, and then the other prison guards is making a knife magically appear in his hand, and then he's throwing it. One kind of standard convention that some people use in comic books is, if there's a lot of action and dynamic activity, they'll start to skew the panel boundaries so that everything reflects that unbalanced sense, almost like in cinema. It's like the Dutch camera or the German expressionist films, who tilted the horizon at a weird angle to give a quality of an unbalanced or uncertainty in there. So you see that a lot, like in Japanese comics, where they'll sort of calm scenes will have vertical and horizontal panel boundaries, and then action scenes thing that the panels start to jumble up. And in American mainstream comics, it's sort of a free-for-all. Like there's all sorts of things going on with crazy panels floating on top of each other and stuff. So my layout is almost quaint in that way. It's sort of an old-fashioned way of laying out the comic book page. And as I was mentioning earlier, this is almost like, in cinema, this is almost like a storyboard. It's just breaking down the beats of the story and breaking down the kind of mood and feeling that the viewer should have as they scan the page. So those faces are almost like cartoon faces. There's just like two dots for eyes and a little growling, angry mouth. And I'm not trying to get to the technical aspects of this yet. That's all going to come later. But I just want to see what kind of mood is happening in each panel. And the task of the comic book page layout is a little bit more complex than a storyboard for a film, because a storyboard is sort of like the big story beats that happen, the important camera shots that have to happen in a film, whereas in a comic book, the panels are all you have. The reader has to interpolate between the panels, because you're not going to spell out every second of the action. So it just has to read, it has to convey the story in a way that, so that the reader understands what's going on, but you can't show an infinite number of panels, because you'll just draw that thing forever. So now I've completed the basic layout, and I'm going to start adding my color keys. And what I like to do is I like to find a photograph that has the color family that I'm going to incorporate into this page. So what I've done here is I found a very nice photograph of a gold-plated toilet bowl that has all the colors that are going to be happening in this scene, which is purples, yellows, and a few warm reddish colors. And all I'm doing is sampling that photograph that I pulled off the internet and applying those colors, just sort of very crudely mopping those colors all over. And by the end of this exercise, the original photograph will be completely obliterated. So obviously the subject of the photograph is completely irrelevant. And again, this starts to get a little bit more into the actual craft of the art. In other words, what I was doing beforehand was just diagrams of how I want things to lay out on the page, but now I'm really considering how I want the final artwork to look, and how I want the texture and the mood of the story to be told. And as such, I care very little about the diagrams, because the pencil work has already been done, or the layout work has already been done. All I want now is the big splash. So in cinema, this is sort of like the color keys, sort of deciding what kind of lighting solutions are going to be happening on each page, and what kind of how the lighting and the color and the mise en scène are going to tell the story and convey the kind of energy that that will be occurring in this scene. I'm getting a little bit more specific now. I've laid in my very rough color map of each panel, and I'm starting to decide how those colors are going to occur on the figure. And again, these are scarcely more than cartoons. I'm kind of making an approximation of how cast shadows fall and where, where eyeballs and elbows occur and stuff like that. But I'm really just interested in how is the color mapping across this particular shot or this particular panel in this case, and not just where lights and shadows fall, but how intense they are, and are they sort of accurate? Yeah, I want the light to be sort of accurate, but more importantly, how is this telling the story? So since this is all really high energy, high octane action, my lighting solution is all stark and bright lights. I want that harsh shadow, and the figure is lit by this giant key light with almost no fill light at all. So it's just creating this electric energy, and that's all very, very conscious. I'm trying to create the mood, and in this particular page the mood is going to be pretty consistent. It's all just energy, but sometimes depending on the page, one panel might be very electric, and then the next panel might be quite calm with lots of mist and diffuse lighting, and maybe even lighting where you can't really tell where the light source is. It's all very atmospheric. But in this case, I want that harshness and that immediacy of a strong light. And as with cinema, the lighting is not realistic. The scene is taking place in a prison that is mostly dark, and it has some skylights up above that have light coming down from the top, but it's not realistic, because in most medieval dungeons they're really quite dark, and you can't have a bunch of figures in your comic book running around in this almost completely dark space, because for many reasons that won't work in a comic book. So suddenly this prison is very brightly lit by this overhead light, because I have to cheat that, and that's, it's the same in movies. If you look at a night scene, they're usually quite bright, as opposed to if you walked out the door at night, depending on where you are, you might not be able to see very much at all. And also I'm starting to add some panels that are rather abstract. These little snippets here are the narrative of this knife magically appearing in the hand of that magical knife thrower. So in this case, it's mostly going to be special effects. There's no kind of logically accepted way of showing a magic knife appearing out of thin air. So I've skipped ahead a little bit here, and I've done the very rough color and light block out for all of my panels, and I've dropped them in, and again I'm just balancing out a little bit how the not just the lighting but also the color mood. I'm adding some layers here that have that are set to blend mode to just balance out my colors. This very short part here, this is one of the parts where I said I'm not going to record the entire page, because this is starting to get into a little bit more of the technical grunt work, like in traditional comics that were done with physical media, so like pencil on paper and stuff. This is the equivalent of the pencils phase of the page. So I'm taking my little stick figures, and I'm actually starting to draw what it specifically looks like and what it technically has to be. So this is the point where I have between that previous phase where I was just throwing in rough colors and this phase where I'm getting accurate, I've taken probably about an hour and just gathered references of I know what that figure's position is supposed to be, or I know what I want, but what does an elbow actually look like when it's bent that way? What does someone's face actually look like when someone's kicking it that way? What does her grimace actually look like? Those kinds of things need to be referenced and researched, or that's my opinion anyway. Everyone has different opinions about references. Some people say if you use lots of photo references, you're cheating. In my opinion, if you're not using references, you're cheating, because if you rely on if you don't use references, you're relying on what you already know, but you're not learning anything new. But if you do have references, that means you're learning something new every time you draw. And as I've said before, you're always gonna find some sort of new surprise in the world if you really observe it, rather than just throwing down your most convenient cliche of what you think the world should look like. Again, that's my style of drawing. That's not how everybody does it, but that's what I like to do. And there's a very specific intellectual process that is important to the reason why I do art in general, which is that I really like the surprises and the unknown, unexpected things that the world will throw at you, and I like to reflect those in my art. So instead of just throwing down my pre-existing assumption of what a figure looks like when it's kicking someone, I want to find like a video of a Thai boxing match or a kickboxing match or something, and see what does the human body actually do when it's in that extreme position. And a lot of times the human body and nature in general are doing their own surprising things that you never expected, and that's what I want to draw. I want to find those things I never expected, and especially the human body. The human body moves in its own ways, and there are limits to how well you can predict that movement. My background is in dance, and whenever we were working on a piece, whenever the choreographer was setting a piece on us, there was always a point where the dancers' bodies did something different, and almost always what the dancers' bodies did was better than what the choreographer had envisioned in the first place. And to me, art is similar. It's finding these surprises that nature will throw at you, and learning from them, and putting down something on the paper that you never expected to end up with in the first place. All right, so I'm jumping ahead now. This is getting into what in traditional comics would be the inking phase. I've created all of my pencils and gotten things to a reasonably good approximation of how I want everything to actually technically fall so that the drawing is accurate. I've taken this into Clip Studio Paint because I like the ink brushes of Clip Studio Paint. I like the way they feel, and the strokes create a nice gesture. And I've set my pencil work to a very low opacity, and I'm drawing on a new layer above that with the blend mode set to multiply. So I don't want my pencil work to intrude very much, because I want to be very cognizant about the gestural and artistic presence of that pen gesture. If the pencil work were very clearly visible, I might rely too much on that pencil work to carry the gesture of the stroke, and then when I turn the pencils off later on in the process, those ink lines might end up looking too wimpy. And one thing about inking in at least in American mainstream comics, the modeling of objects, so the way that objects are indicated if they're round or flat or turning a corner and stuff, a lot of that modeling is carried by the ink work. So you see a lot of cross-hatching, you see a lot of cast shadows and things like that. My inking does not do that. The color is going to carry all of the modeling work. So the inks are just a very strictly a contour, the contour that delineates one object separated from the other, or one object separated from the background, or objects that overlap. So, for example, the wrinkles in her shorts are these sort of folds of cloth that are all convoluted inside of each other, so that's going to get a black line. But the way that those folds kind of become soft is not indicated at all. It's just the line just stops, and it's the same way like with those toes there. It's just the toes overlapping, but things like the toenails and things don't show up at all, because all of that is going to get handled in the coloring phase. The other thing that I need to remain conscious of is that all of my lines are closed. So I should be able to take a pen and draw all the way around each contour and never pick the pen up off the paper. There should be no gaps. And the reason is that when I get into the coloring, I want to be able to use my magic wand tool to select areas to color. And obviously if there are gaps in the line, then the magic wand is going to select a whole bunch of stuff that I don't want. And that's different from the way most traditional American comic books are organized, because if the inking carries a lot of the modeling, so if there's a lot of cross-hatching and things, then using the magic wand is not going to work. You're going to have to use different techniques, which I'll go into a little bit later on. But this is a little bit more like European comics, where you just have a very clean contour line, or relatively clean contour line, and then everything else is held by the coloring phase, which is just the technique that I like, mostly because my sensibilities tend to be more like a very photographic rendering. I don't want that sort of heavy ink work, which I love really good ink work, but for my particular techniques, or for this particular comic book, I'm definitely going for a slightly more painterly approach to the rendering. So I've skipped ahead again. I've completed all of the inks on this page. I'm going into defining my flats, or what's called flatting in the mainstream comic book industry, and that's simply defining a flat shape for each logical object in the scene. And the way I'm doing this is I'm using my magic wand to select the area around my figures, and then I'm contracting that selection so that my selection line appears as closely as possible to the middle of that line thickness. The reason that I'm doing that is to make a reasonable approximation of what's called trapping, which is that if one color changes into another, that change should happen underneath the black line, so that if there's any sort of misalignment, or if you have a bit of color that goes outside of the line, or where colors meet up but don't quite contact each other, that mistake will be occurring underneath the ink line and it won't be noticeable to the viewer. Trapping is primarily a big deal in offset printing comics. You'll have to be very aware of how to properly trap if you're doing prepress for printed comics. And this comic is a web comic, which means it'll never be printed. So to some extent, being really methodical about trapping is theoretically not as important. However, one should be very careful about how highly contrasting colors butt up against each other, because let's say there's a little bit of a color that's coming where I've taken, maybe there's just one pixel that's occurring outside of the line and occurring where it's not supposed to be. If you look at this document, which is 2,000 pixels wide by about 2,600 pixels high, that one little pixel won't matter. It's too small. But if I'm viewing this page at a smaller resolution, such as what you would see in, let's say, on an Android or something, I have to downsample my resolution, and whatever algorithm is being used to downsample that pixel might very well interpret it in some way where that one pixel becomes much more noticeable, and suddenly you have some sort of weird artifact occurring where you didn't anticipate it when you saw the page at full resolution. So I like to cover myself as much as possible and put my color breaks underneath that thick line so that if I've done something wrong, it won't show up, because the black layer of my Photoshop document is covering up that mistake. All right, so enough about flats. What I'm doing here is I'm putting in my rough modeling phase. And this is, if this were a Renaissance oil painting, this would be the equivalent of using my burnt umbers and yellow ochres to create an underpainting, which is simply defining the masses and volumes of my subject. I'm not making any attempt, or I'm making a very minimal attempt at actually defining the hue and the material of my objects. And if you were to look at, let's say, Renaissance or classical oil paintings, you would see a lot of very complicated painterly effects, a lot of different kind of edges, hard edges, medium edges, soft edges, indistinct edges, and many different kinds of textures being created with brushes and glazes. But since this is a webcomic, I've abbreviated my palette of painterly textures very extremely, where what I've done is I've laid in these razor sharp, crisp edges on one part of any object, and then I've also added these feathered, airbrushy edges within the same object. So it's either a really crisp edge or a really blurry edge. That's a very limited palette of rendering look, and there's almost no textural quality, and all of that is slightly less realistic and less interesting as a piece of art. But since this is a webcomic, I need to do everything I possibly can to reduce my production time. So I'm creating textures and a painting style that is just barely enough to convince the viewer of the kind of mood and look that I want, without really going nuts about getting very subtle about how artistic it looks. And a very abbreviated style also runs the risk of characters looking sort of like Barbie dolls or something. It's a little bit too slick. But again, I'm making a lot of sacrifices for the sake of getting a reasonable production time on these things. And since this is a web comic, I'm not actually making any money off of this, so I'm highly incentivized to get as much work done with a minimum amount of effort and still create the kind of look that my vision is trying to achieve as an artist. And this is still blocking in colors here, and even though there are some kind of texture, some edges that have a little bit more of an artistic stroke to them, a lot of that's going to get covered up with an airbrush later on. And another thing, I'm still blocking in edges, but as I've completed this very rough modeling phase, I'm going to start indicating local hues and the actual materials that these objects are made out of. In this case, I'm putting in the figures first. Those figures are made out of skin and bone. And once you start actually rendering materials, it's going to be very helpful to have an intellectual understanding of what's going on. It's not just a question of copying a particular shade of brown or orange or whatever faithfully to your reference. You're much better off starting to understand how light is interacting with any given material. And the reason that I chose to work on this, or to record this first panel, is because you've got a lot of different materials going on in there that are worth being a little bit more subtle about. Specifically, like the skin tones, we have European skin with the bald woman on the left and the African woman on the right, and then we have the dark African skin tones. And one thing you kind of want to understand is that the very darkly pigmented skin is going to be more opaque than the light skin. So dark skin is reflecting more light, and the kinds of phenomena that conspire to give the material a particular look are going to be very different in black skin than they are going to be in European skin, and you should have an understanding of what's going on. So specifically, anytime you're rendering something, you're trying to figure out what kind of phenomena are conspiring to give any given pixel its color. And in darkly pigmented skin, you're going to get a lot more reflective components, and specifically Fresnel components, where if you do a lot of 3D rendering, you're probably more familiar with the Fresnel effect. But the idea is that as an edge recedes away from you, or if an object, if a plane becomes parallel to your line of view, it's going to become more reflective. So you can see that the edges of her skin are a little bit more light and cool colored, sort of like the cool color of the background. And that's because there's more, you can see more reflective phenomena happening in that darkly pigmented skin. Now, the European skin also has a lot of, it's also reflecting the light quality of its environment, and there's also Fresnel going on. However, those reflective components are less apparent because European skin is considerably more translucent than African skin. So that translucency starts to become a much more dominant factor in how the materials are being shaded. Right now what I'm actually doing is I'm going back in, like I said, like I indicated earlier, I'm going in with that very feathery airbrush and smoothing out those edges. So what I'm left with is really either a crisp, knife clean edge or a very ambiguous, blurry edge. And again, this is just blocking out very general color tones. I haven't started really fine-tuning the local hue, but I'm just getting rid of a lot of those scribbly edges, because that's a whole different kind of artistic style that I'm not going for in this particular work. And it should really, there should really be just like a very smooth, blurry quality or a very crisp quality, and that gives, if people see those kinds of crisp or blurry edges, they tend to believe the object or believe that it's kind of photorealistic, when in fact it's really just a very simplified attempt at fooling the viewer into thinking there's a lot more going on than there really is. And what I'm doing now is I'm making a copy of that layer and then changing the blend mode to soft light, and that tends to increase the vibrancy of the colors. And what I've done there is, what I'm doing right now is I've made a copy of my background layer. The background is all that crazy gestural, very loose, scribbly stuff. I've taken a copy of just that part of the background, just where the figure is, put that copy on top of my figure layer, and then change the blend mode to soft light again, so that there's just a very slight indication of those tans and purples informing the color of the figure. So I'm trying to bring just a very slight hint of the background color right into the skin tones, just to kind of mimic the way that any object is going to have a slight quality of its background color in there. And now I've used the dodge tool, as you can see on her shoulder. I've used the dodge tool to again indicate a little bit of that Fresnel effect, like that there's a slightly enhanced reflectivity on the edges of the skin tones. And I've also taken my big giant airbrush and set the blend mode of the airbrush to color dodge, and used that to just pick out a few very vibrant colors, like around her neck, around her cheeks, and her nose, just to give a very slight amount of glow there. One reason I'm doing that, and one reason I'm doing that specifically with the nose and the ears, is because, like I said, European skin tends to be more translucent than African skin. So I want to indicate that light is penetrating her skin and is kind of bouncing around underneath the skin and creating a slight glow effect, and creating a slight increase in the vibrancy of the color. And again, if anyone is familiar with 3D rendering, you've probably heard the term subsurface scattering, which in 3D rendering is kind of the equivalent of mimicking that effect of light bouncing around inside of a translucent object. And you can sort of see that in real life, like if you see someone backlit, if you look at their ears or their nose or their fingers, they're kind of glowing a little bit with that light that's coming through the skin and bouncing around inside of there, and there's a slight red glow there. So even though most of my colors are laid in a very basic sense, I'm still going back and once my colors have been laid in a basic sense, I've started to go back and see how my backgrounds are interacting with the figures. As you can see now, I've skipped ahead where I've laid in all of my basic rendering for all of the figures that are occurring in this page, and now it's a question of integrating the figures into the background. So it's, even though there's a lot of technical stuff that has to go on in terms of how to render the muscles and bones and that embossed leather and the golden earrings or whatever, I can't leave it at that. Ultimately, what has the deliverable product has to be a fully coherent artwork. And now that I've laid in the basic textures, the rest of this process is going to be just integrating all of the objects in any given frame so that they all work together. And I've also I've started to just put in the very basic groundwork of the backgrounds in those bottom two panels. And even though this is an action scene, so you don't really want to get too crazy on the background, you still have to indicate some context of what's going on and where these figures are where this action is happening. So I'm just adding a slight bit of that stone texture because this room is paved with stone, but I don't want to go too crazy with it. It's just to indicate it's there. Most of what I'm doing really here is creating that sort of exciting electric energy to reinforce that this is a very immediate, very dynamic scene that's going on. And likewise, even though this is in a very dimly lit room, I've suddenly just put this very bright key light on the figures so that you're getting that highly dynamic quality. I don't want to have this being like a very calm and moody scene. It's supposed to be quite intense. The other thing I need to start to convey to the user is what I mentioned earlier, where part of the story is that this guy is magically conjuring a knife that then appears in his hand. So I want to indicate this sort of visual effect glow of a knife appearing out of nowhere, which he then throws, so that in the last scene it starts to become a real knife. But in the previous panel it's just this glowing hand, and then visually you can see that knife appearing there. And now I'm going even more extremely away from reality, where I'm putting these sort of motion lines to indicate even more energy, almost as if the camera is whizzing by this scene and catching these snippets of action. So I've added those yellow lines, which are kind of a convention in the Japanese manga comics, where they'll throw in these kind of lines that indicate the flow of the action. Even though I'm not like a huge fan of manga, I like that visual convention, so I might as well use it. In the last panel, I'm going to indicate a little bit more environment, and specifically I built a model of this room in ZBrush. Those are those kind of statue-like objects that are part of the architecture. I've dropped it into the frame, set the blend mode to I think overlay or maybe soft light, and I'm just indicating a slight quality of those sculpted forms, but I definitely have to go over them with texture, and even though the blend mode is soft light, I've still reduced the opacity of that layer, so you're just getting a sense of a room back there, but I definitely want it to recede a lot, otherwise it's going to become more of an architectural rendering and less about the story. So now I'm just again really concentrating just on, does this tell the story properly? And I'm adding some more effects here to make that knife really jump out of the panel, because that's the only reason that panel is there, that this knife is flying through the air. So I've started to add on my special effects layer, I added that glow so it's really jumping out, and I've also made the knife a lot darker than what I originally had intended, because it's going to be coming forward of those yellow motion lines. And what I'm doing right now is I'm moving that figure up. The reason being that the figure was very close to the edge of the panel, and that's going to put me, since this is a full bleed page, I know that objects are going to be bleeding slightly off of the edge of those panels, and I don't want my important subject matter to be like banging right up against the edges. I want a little bit of airspace around there. So I've just, in that last figure down there, I kind of moved everything in a little bit so that it doesn't, if there's, if you can see the figure is leaning in, and it's very clear, it's very normal for that figure to be cropped like that. But if there's just like one fingertip or one earlobe that's sort of hanging off of the page, it's going to look like a mistake. So I just want to make sure that all of my tangents are working well. I don't want objects sort of hovering too close to each other in this very ambiguous way. So this is pretty much the end of the page. I think I still fine-tuned a few things, but it's pretty much the way it's going to look when it's published. So I hope this video has been informative and helpful to you, and I will see you all next time. All right, take care.